What happens when a CEO goes undercover in his own warehouse and catches a worker eating from the trash? David Lawson had built his company from the ground up. A decade ago, he was the one loading boxes, negotiating contracts, and making deliveries. Now, with 12 warehouses across the state, he spent his days in boardrooms, reviewing numbers and trusting managers to keep things running. But lately, something felt off. Customer complaints were piling up: delayed shipments, damaged goods, and rude service. Employee turnover was higher than ever, and despite strong revenue, efficiency had plummeted. Reports from his regional managers painted a different picture, assuring him everything was fine. But David wasn't convinced, so he decided to see for himself. Disguising himself as a new trainee named Dan, David shaved off his neatly trimmed beard, wore thick-rimmed glasses, and donned an old hoodie and worn-out jeans. He made sure to apply at the warehouse farthest from headquarters, where no one had ever met him in person. The hiring process was shockingly easy. No real training, no background check, just a quick rundown from the shift supervisor, and he was handed a scanner. "Stick with the other guys and don't screw up," the man grunted before walking off. The warehouse was chaos. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, forklifts zipped around recklessly, and workers looked exhausted. Some moved like robots, others whispered complaints under their breath. His first task was sorting inventory with a small team, and that's where he met Eric. Eric was young, maybe early 20s, with tired eyes and a uniform that looked 2 sizes too big. Despite his exhaustion, he worked hard, moving twice as fast as everyone else. But something about him seemed off. He flinched when the supervisor walked by and kept glancing at the clock like he was waiting for a break that would never come. During lunch, David sat near the back, observing. Most workers brought packed meals or microwaved instant noodles, but Eric had nothing. He sat alone, staring at the vending machine like he was debating whether to spend the last of his money. Then David saw it. Eric glanced around, making sure no one was watching. Then he walked over to a trash bin near the break area, reached in, and pulled out half a sandwich wrapped in paper. He unwrapped it carefully, inspecting it like it was a treasure. Then he took a small bite, chewing slowly. David felt something tighten in his chest. He stood up, walked over, and kept his voice low. "Hey man, you okay?" Eric froze mid-bite, eyes darting up in panic. I wasn't stealing. It was already thrown away," he stammered. David's stomach churned. "You don't have food?" Eric hesitated, then shrugged. "I get paid Friday, just gotta make it till then." David sat down beside him. "You don't have money for food?" Eric let out a hollow laugh. "Not after rent, not after paying off what I owe." He looked away. "It's fine, I've done worse." David clenched his fists. This wasn't just a struggling worker, this was desperation. Before he could say more, the supervisor stormed over. "Eric, get back to work." "Break's over." Eric stuffed the rest of the sandwich in his pocket, nodded, and hurried off. David watched him go, his mind racing. Something was very, very wrong in his company. And he was going to find out exactly what. David spent the next few hours working alongside the other employees, keeping his head down but paying close attention. The warehouse was understaffed, and those who remained were exhausted. Orders piled up faster than they could be processed, and the supervisors barked orders but did little to help. The real problem became clear when David saw how management treated the workers. At one point, a worker named Lewis accidentally dropped a box, sending its contents spilling across the floor. It wasn't anything fragile, just some packaged goods, but the reaction was immediate. "Are you serious, Lewis?" The shift supervisor, a thick-set man named Carl, stormed over. "You think we got time for this?" Lewis scrambled to pick up the items. "It slipped. I don't want to hear it. That's coming out of your paycheck." David stiffened. "Wait, that's not," Carl turned on him. "You got something to say, rookie?" David forced himself to stay calm. Just seems like an accident. Shouldn't the company cover that? Carl scoffed. Company doesn't pay for screw-ups. You break it, you pay for it. That's how it works here. Lewis kept his head down, face tight with frustration, but he didn't argue. David could see why. No one wanted to risk their job, not when they were barely scraping by. Later, during a short break, David caught up with Eric near the loading dock. "You okay?" David asked. Eric shrugged. "Same as always." David hesitated, then decided to go for it. "Carl said broken items come out of paychecks. That legal?" Eric let out a dry laugh. "No, but nobody fights it." "You argue you get fewer shifts, less money, you get the idea." David's stomach churned. "That happened to you." Eric didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "Last month a whole pallet got knocked over. Carl blamed me, took half my paycheck to cover damages." David's jaw clenched. This wasn't just bad management, it was exploitation. He needed to see how far it went. That night, when the shift ended, David lingered in the locker area, pretending to tie his boot. Carl was near the exit, chatting with another supervisor, a lanky man named Rick. "Payroll cut again this week?" Rick asked. Carl smirked. "Yeah. Told corporate we had too much overtime, so they knocked it down. Suckers'll just have to work faster." Rick chuckled. "You dock Lewis for that box." "Damn right. Idiot needs to learn." David's fists tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed more. The next day, he arrived early and found Eric near the loading dock again. The kid looked even worse than before, dark circles under his eyes. "Eric," David said carefully, "can I ask you something?" Eric sighed. "If it's about yesterday, forget it." "Arguing doesn't change anything." David shook his head. "Not arguing, just how bad is it here?" Eric studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. "You really want to know?" David nodded. Eric leaned against the wall. "They keep us just desperate enough to stay. Hours get cut at random, so you never know what your paycheck will be. They say it's demand-based, but it's just control. If you piss off Carl, your hours drop. You push back, you're out." David's chest tightened. "And complaints?" Eric scoffed. "To who? Carl, Rick, they're all the same, HR. Might as well talk to a wall." David's mind raced. How had this gone on so long? How had the reports from management been so wrong? Then Eric hesitated before adding, "And if you're really desperate, they'll offer you advances." David frowned. "Advances?" Eric's jaw clenched. "Loans from Carl. But the interest is brutal. You fall behind and suddenly you owe him more than you can ever pay back. Then your hours get cut and you're stuck." David felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't just bad management, this was a racket. Carl was running a predatory system inside David's own company, and David was going to put an end to it. David had seen enough. He couldn't let this continue. He waited until the next shift started before making his move. Instead of heading straight to the floor, he went to the small, grimy office where Carl and Rick ran things. He knocked once, then pushed the door open. Carl barely looked up from his clipboard. "What do you want?" David shut the door behind him. "We need to talk." Rick smirked. "New guy's got guts." David pulled off his glasses. Then in a calm, firm voice he said, "I'm David Lawson." Carl blinked. "Who?" David let the silence stretch. Then he pulled out his phone, opened the company website, and turned the screen toward them. His own face stared back from the About Us page. Rick's smirk vanished. Carl's face lost color. David stepped closer. "I own this company, and I've spent the last 2 days watching you bleed my employees dry." Carl stiffened. This is some kind of joke." David's voice dropped to a lethal calm. "You've been docking pay illegally. You've been cutting hours as punishment. And worst of all, you've been running a predatory loan scheme on my workers." Rick swallowed hard. "Look, David cut him off. "Save it, I've heard enough." He turned to Carl. "Give me your keys." Carl's mouth opened, then shut. His hands clenched into fists. David held out his hand. Now. Carl yanked the keys from his belt and slapped them into David's palm. David stepped back and pocketed them. You're done here, both of you, Carl's face twisted. You think you can just walk in here? And David's voice was ice. I don't think I know. You're fired. Security will escort you out. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Get down to the warehouse. Now. Carl's jaw worked like he wanted to argue, but he wasn't stupid. He grabbed his bag off the desk and stormed out. Rick followed, pale and silent. David exhaled slowly, then turned to the office computer. He logged in using his master credentials. Within minutes, he had access to payroll records, shift schedules, and disciplinary reports. The patterns were clear. Carl and Rick had been manipulating the system for years. The damage deductions alone added up to tens of thousands stolen from employees. David's stomach churned. He pulled up Eric's profile. The kid's payroll history was a roller coaster of deductions, cut hours, and performance penalties. No wonder he was eating out of the trash. David clenched his jaw. Not anymore. He left the office and headed straight to the break room where the workers were gathering for their shift. The room fell silent as he stepped inside. Eric was there, standing near the back. His eyes widened. Wait, you're… David nodded. Yeah, he looked around the room. I own this company and I owe you all an apology. A few murmurs rippled through the group. David took a deep breath. I went undercover because I had a feeling things weren't right. What I saw here, it was worse than I imagined. His gaze swept over them. Carl and Rick are gone. Effective immediately. A stunned silence followed. Then, a few workers exchanged glances before breaking into cautious smiles. David wasn't done. The illegal pay deductions stopped today. If you had money unfairly taken from your checks, you're getting it back. Full back pay, no exceptions. Now, the murmurs turned to full conversations. Relief, disbelief, even cautious hope. David turned to Eric. And you? He pulled his wallet out and handed the kid a few $100s in cash. Eat, no more trash, understand? Eric's hands shook as he took the money. His throat bobbed. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, just eat. David straightened. And one last thing, we're restructuring this entire warehouse. New management, better scheduling, and a direct line for complaints. No more retaliation, no more fear. A few workers clapped, others nodded, smiling. David exhaled. This wasn't over, there was a lot of work ahead. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was finally running his company the way he should have been all along. The next morning, David arrived at the warehouse early. He wanted to see firsthand how things ran without Carl and Rick poisoning the place. The workers were cautious, unsure if the changes would really stick. Years of mistreatment didn't just disappear overnight. David understood that. Trust had to be rebuilt. He gathered the entire shift together before they started. I know you've heard promises before. I know managers have said things would change and then nothing happened. But I give you my word, this isn't just talk. A few skeptical glances, but also some nods. David continued. Effective immediately. I'm bringing in a new warehouse manager, someone who actually cares about the workers and knows what it's like to be in your shoes. Until then, I'll be filling in myself. That got a reaction. Workers exchanged looks. A CEO running warehouse shifts. That wasn't something they'd seen before. David turned to Lewis, the worker Carl had unfairly docked pay from. You've been here a while, right? Lewis nodded. 6 years. David smiled. Then you probably know this place better than anyone. I need your help making things right. Lewis hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Yeah, I can do that. David turned to Eric next. You still want to work here? Eric's eyes widened. You're not firing me, David shook his head. Not a chance, but I want to make sure this job actually works for you. Fair hours, fair pay, no more games. Eric swallowed hard, then nodded. Yeah, I'd like that. With that settled, David got to work. Over the next few days, he personally oversaw every shift. He made sure hours were distributed fairly, payroll was properly calculated, and every worker knew they could come to him with issues. He implemented an anonymous reporting system for complaints. He brought in HR representatives who actually listened. Most importantly, he started fixing the toxic culture Carl had built. Without fear of retaliation, employees began to speak up. They shared ideas for efficiency improvements, pointed out logistical problems, and suggested ways to make the work less grueling. Turns out, the people actually doing the job had the best solutions. David took notes, then he took action. He ordered repairs for faulty equipment. He adjusted scheduling to prevent burnout. He even arranged for a rotating food stipend, ensuring no worker had to go hungry on shift again. The atmosphere in the warehouse started to shift. The weight of fear and exhaustion lifted little by little. Workers laughed more. They helped each other instead of just surviving the day. At the end of the week, David called another meeting. "I've spent the last few days working alongside you, and I've learned more about my own company than I ever did in a boardroom. And I want to make sure no CEO ever gets this disconnected again." He took a deep breath. "So, from now on, every executive in this company will be required to spend 1 week per year working in a warehouse or on a delivery route. No exceptions." A few workers blinked in surprise. Lewis let out a low whistle. "You serious?" David nodded. "Dead serious. If I had done this sooner, a lot of the problems you've faced wouldn't have lasted this long. That's my mistake. And I won't let it happen again." The room was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, people started clapping. Not the forced kind, not the kind workers gave when a boss made empty promises. This was real. David exhaled. He hadn't just fixed a warehouse, he'd fixed something in himself. And for the first time in years, he felt like he truly deserved to run this company. The changes didn't come without resistance. Not from the workers, they embraced the improvements almost immediately, but from upper management. A few days after Carl and Rick were fired, David sat in a boardroom at headquarters, facing a group of executives who were clearly uneasy. "David," one of them, Mark, the head of operations, began hesitantly, "I understand that what you found in that warehouse was unacceptable. No one is arguing with that. But we have systems in place for handling these things. Going undercover like this, was that really necessary?" David leaned back in his chair, studying them. "If I had relied on systems, Carl and Rick would still be running that warehouse like a personal fiefdom. Workers would still be getting exploited. Tell me, Mark, how many complaints about that warehouse made it to your desk?" Mark hesitated. "Well, none," David nodded. "Exactly, because the system failed. Because people were too afraid to report, because the managers in charge controlled the flow of information." A few executives shifted in their seats. Another executive, Linda, cleared her throat. "We're not saying the changes aren't good, but you're shaking things up too fast, requiring executives to work in the warehouses. That's unconventional." David let out a short laugh. "Unconventional? Maybe, but necessary. I spent years trusting reports, numbers, and second-hand accounts. And it blinded me to what was really happening." His voice hardened. "That won't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone else in this company." A long silence stretched across the room. Then one of the younger executives, Rachel, spoke up. "I think it's a great idea." A few heads turned. Rachel shrugged. "If we're making decisions that affect frontline workers, we should at least understand their jobs. Spending a week in their world isn't too much to ask." David smiled. "Exactly." Mark exhaled through his nose but didn't push further. The others hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. They didn't like change, but they weren't going to fight David on this. He had made up his mind. Back at the warehouse, the transformation continued. David brought in a new warehouse manager, a woman named Teresa, who had worked in logistics for years and had a reputation for fairness. She spent her first few days walking the floor, talking to workers and taking notes. Unlike Carl, she actually listened. "First thing we're changing," she told David one afternoon, "is shift planning. These guys have been overworked to the point of exhaustion. We need a better rotation system." David nodded. Do whatever it takes. He wasn't just delegating anymore, he was involved. He spent time in different warehouses, checking on conditions, talking to employees without warning middle management beforehand. He wanted to see the real picture, not the cleaned-up version. And it was working. Productivity improved not because people were scared, but because they were treated with dignity. Turnover dropped, customer complaints decreased. But the biggest sign of change came from Eric. One evening, as David was finishing up paperwork in the office, there was a knock on the door. Eric stood there, looking awkward. Got a minute?" David nodded. "Of course, come in." Eric hesitated before stepping inside. He glanced around, then exhaled. "I just wanted to say thanks for everything." David smiled. "You don't have to thank me, Eric. I should have caught this sooner." Eric nodded, then looked down. "Still, I've never had a boss care before." "Not like this." He hesitated, then added, "I was thinking, I don't want to just work here forever, I want to do more." David leaned in. "What do you have in mind?" Eric swallowed. "I want to move up, maybe into logistics, maybe even management, but like, the right kind of management." David grinned. "We can make that happen." For the first time since David had met him, Eric looked like he believed it, and that, more than anything, told David he was on the right path.